Hi everybody, this is a quick video about the sign of an elasticity coefficient, which is a positive or a negative sign. And the reason for that is because there's some confusion sometimes about the relevance of the sign, especially for price elasticity of demand. So for example, here's a multiple choice question which says the price of train travel increases by 10% and the should be quantity demanded of train travel falls by 12.5%. The price elasticity of demand for train travel is, and then an answer has been selected, 1.25. Now if we did the calculation for price elasticity of demand, where we put the effect over the cause, that is the percentage change in the quantity demanded over the percentage change in price, we get this. It's negative 12.5% because it's a decrease in the quantity demanded of train travel, and positive 10% because it's an increase in the price of train travel, and therefore we get a price elasticity of demand coefficient of negative 1.25. And yet this happens to be the correct answer. Now that's true if and only if there's no negative 1.25 as an option. The other options might be, say, 8 or 11 or minus 1 or something like that. But if there's only 1.25, then that's going to be the correct answer. So why is that? Why isn't the negative sign relevant in that particular case? If we think about what the negative sign signifies, what's it mean? It's indicating that the law of demand is in operation. If we remember the law of demand, we could express it like this. For an increase in the price of a good, there's a decrease in the quantity demanded for that good, ceteris paribus. That is, assuming nothing else changes. So if we then represented this in a way where we can calculate price elasticity of demand, we'd be saying for a positive percentage change in the price, there's a negative percentage change in the quantity demanded, ceteris paribus, which we can then use to calculate the price elasticity of demand coefficient. That is, we put the effect over the cause, and because it's a negative divided by a positive, the answer is going to be a negative number. Alternatively, we could say same law of demand expressed in the other direction. For a decrease in the price, there's an increase in the quantity demanded, ceteris paribus. Or in other words, for a decrease in the price or a change in the price that's negative as a percentage, there's an increase, positive, an increase in the quantity demanded, some percentage. So when we write that out, effect over the cause, again we've got a positive divided by a negative. So when we have a positive divided by a negative, we're always going to get a negative answer. So if the law of demand is in operation, we're always going to have a price elasticity of demand coefficient that's negative. That's always going to be the case. And since that's always the case when the law of demand is operating, economists will often just ignore the negative sign because it's not providing any new information. We already know that when the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. When the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. That is, the variables are inversely related or negatively related. And that's why it will often be expressed in absolute terms. We can symbolize that with these two parallel lines either side of the coefficient. So meaning that we're expressing it as a positive number. Okay? And that's why this answer ends up being correct. Alright, let's say a bit more. Now this doesn't apply, that is, just expressing coefficients in absolute terms, that is, ignoring the sign, it doesn't apply for other elasticity measures. The sign can provide very valuable information for other elasticity measures. So for example, let's take cross-price elasticity of demand. Let's say we're interested in what's the relationship between the price of rice and the quantity demanded of bread. So we're at two different products, two different markets. When there's a change in the price of rice by some percentage, what happens to the quantity demanded of bread by some percentage? Now, you could think for yourself, well, I know the answer to that already, but maybe you need to rethink that, because it could depend on the particular context, that is, the particular market you're looking at. So, for example, it might be entirely possible, so I think for at least some percentage of Australians, it might be the case that when the price of rice goes up, the quantity demanded of bread goes up. Right? We might find that relationship. So if we express that in terms of the cross-price elasticity of demand coefficient, we put the effect over the cause, we find that there is a positive relationship. That is, the coefficient, the cross-price elasticity of demand coefficient, is positive. It's greater than 0. What's that indicating to us? It tells us that, ceteris paribus, assuming nothing else is changing, that rice and bread for these consumers are regarded as substitutes. So when the price of rice goes up, people decrease the quantity of rice they demand, and they switch over to a substitute, an alternative, in this case bread. So the coefficient, if it's positive, tells us that rice and bread are substitutes, they're alternatives. Handy to know if you're in the bread market, because you know that the quantity demanded of bread is impacted by what happens in the rice market. But it's also entirely possible in a different context. Say, for example, if you went to, say, Indonesia, then you might find this kind of relationship. When the price of rice goes up by some percentage, it leads to no change in the quantity demanded of bread. If we express it in this way, effect over cause, no change in the quantity demanded of bread as a percentage, but an increase in the price of rice by some percentage, our coefficient would be 0. What does that coefficient mean? How do we interpret it? It means that there's no relationship between the price of rice and the quantity demanded of bread. That is, rice and bread are not substitutes at all. And that's maybe because of the particular cultural norms which have impacted, and due to the history of the country and so on, which have impacted on the vast majority of consumers' preferences. They don't believe rice and bread are substitutes for each other. All right? But you wouldn't know that unless you go and check. And the sign, whether it's, say for example in this case positive, or it's neither positive nor negative, tells you about that relationship. So the sign is important. What if we were thinking about income elasticity of demand? Let's take the example of Starbucks. So here we're interested in what happens to the quantity demanded of Starbucks coffees due to a change in consumers' incomes. Well, it's entirely possible, for example, in Australia, that an increase in consumers' incomes leads to a decrease in the quantity demanded of Starbucks, or expressed differently, in this way to calculate our income elasticity of demand coefficient, effect over cause, decrease in the quantity demanded of Starbucks due to an increase in income. Obviously, M here means income or money. So our coefficient is negative. A negative sign over a positive sign gives us a negative sign. That is, a number less than 0. And what does it tell us? It tells us that from the perspective of consumers in this particular market, that Starbucks coffee is deemed an inferior product, an inferior good. there are alternatives available which are deemed superior. Right? And that might make sense. If people's incomes fall, or if people are poor, they might buy more Starbucks coffee. But as their incomes rise and they become wealthier, they might stop going to Starbucks and start going to more quote-unquote upmarket cafes with better, inverted commas, better quality coffee from the perspective of the consumers. And as we can see there, this is actually a picture of a Starbucks in Parramatta, and you can see all of the desperately poor people sitting here. I'm joking, of course. On the other hand, if we went to an entirely different context, we might find this. So, for example, again, we use the example of Indonesia. As people's incomes rise, the quantity demanded of Starbucks coffees goes up, or expressed in terms of cross-price elasticity of demand, effect over cause, increase in the quantity of Starbucks coffees due to, divided by, the increase in people's incomes. We know that the income elasticity of demand coefficient will be greater than 0. It will be positive. And we know that. So positive over a positive gives you a positive number. What does that tell us? It's telling us that Indonesian consumers regard Starbucks as at least a normal product. In fact, I'd hazard a guess that they regard it as a superior product. As your income rises, you'll buy more and more Starbucks coffee proportional to your income. Right? The proportion goes up. All right. Perhaps that's again a kind of a cultural norm or a cultural perception that Starbucks is a kind of a Western American chain and therefore is sometimes deemed to be superior or better in some way. But certainly if you go to Indonesia and you go to a Starbucks cafe and you look carefully at the clientele, you'll see that they are people in their 20s and 30s, maybe in their 40s, and they're definitely, in no way are they poor. They're middle to high income consumers. Alright, what about advertising elasticity of demand? So if we were talking about an increase in advertising expenditure, what happens to the quantity demanded for the product that's being advertised? Ceteris paribus, of course, assuming nothing else changes in the marketplace. So let's look at an example of an ad and see if you can have a guess at what's going to happen with the relationship between advertising expenditure and quantity demanded.
Hello? Hey, what's up? Nothing, B. Just watching the game, having a bud. What's up with you? None. Watching the game, having a bud. True. What's up? Yo, who's that? Yo, pick up the phone. Hello? What's that? What's up? Yo, where's Dookie? Yo, Dookie. Yo. What's up? What's that? Hold on. Hello? So what's up, B? Watching the game, having a bud. True.
Okay, now in that case, for that ad, what was found that the increasing advertising expenditure as a percentage led to an increase in the quantity demanded as a percentage. So if we expressed it in terms of the advertising elasticity of demand, we'd say, because a positive over a positive gives you a positive number, the advertising elasticity of demand coefficient will be positive too. It will be greater than 0. And that's indeed the case for this particular ad. It was an extremely successful advertisement for Budweiser. Let's look at another example, also from Budweiser, from 2015. So by 2015, of course, advertising on television is still very important, but we have the rise of Twitter, and so you have hashtag campaigns. And Budweiser in 2015 launched the hashtag Up For Whatever campaign. And associated with that was this labelling that they added to their Bud Lights. As you can see there, it says, "The perfect beer for removing no from your vocabulary for the night." And the additional line, "The perfect beer for whatever happens." So things had moved on from 1999, but the advertising eggheads at Budweiser obviously hadn't moved on, because this came to be interpreted as a kind of suggestion that Budweiser was a good way to get away with date rape. So that was a particularly disastrous campaign, as it turns out, and as a result we had this relationship between the advertising expenditure and the quantity demanded. That is, the increase in advertising expenditure represented as a percentage led to or contributed to the decrease in the quantity demanded of Bud Light. Represented as a ratio, effect over cause, a negative over a positive gives us a negative coefficient. That is a coefficient less than 0. That coefficient less than 0 tells us that advertising expenditure was not just unsuccessful in increasing demand for Bud Light, but in fact contributed to a fall in demand for Bud Light. Now, in the real world, and in this particular case as well, it's difficult to disentangle the other things that are in fact going on in the economy, or in this particular market, the beer market. Because in the United States, in the beer market, as in many other Western countries, the demand for beer is on a secular decline. That is, there is a trend decline. And this advertising, the failure of this advertising is mixed in with that overall decrease in demand due to changing preferences in favour of other alcoholic beverages or non-alcoholic beverages. So it's difficult to say how much this advertising campaign contributed to the fall in demand, but analysts generally agree that it certainly didn't help, and it probably contributed to the continued downward fall in demand for beer. One other thing that I'll mention, this is now a long video, is remember that I talked about, when I talked about price elasticity of demand, I said that very often economists will simply ignore the negative sign because they will assume that the law of demand is in operation. That is, the price will go in one direction and the quantity demanded will go in the other direction. So you'll get a negative coefficient every time. However, it's worth bearing in mind what that sign is sometimes, because it's possible that you can get cases where the law of demand doesn't apply. Right? The law of demand is violated. So, for example, this is just an example of someone I knew who became a psychologist. They went off to Canberra to become a clinical psychologist, and they looked around at the prices being charged for psychological counselling, and they decided, well, the best way to break into this market is to charge a lower price than everyone else. They did that, and they didn't get any customers. So what they instead decided to try was to increase the price of their counselling services. They advertised a higher price, and that resulted in an increase from 0 to some customers. In other words, when the price went up, the quantity demanded also went up. That is violating the law of demand. So we have a positive, in this case, a positive price elasticity of demand coefficient. Why might that have occurred? That seems pretty odd. Well, it's possible that in the case of, for example, psychological counselling services, the price of a product might be an indicator to consumers of the quality of the product. Because for counselling services, you can't really know the quality of the product until you've gone and had counselling services, and it's not like you're buying counselling services every day of the week like Mars bars or Coca-Cola. You're not going to know the nature of the product until you've purchased it. So people will often take the price as an indicator of quality. The higher the price, the better the counsellor. Another example is luxury exotic sports cars, such as this one here. It's the Lamborghini, one of the latest Lamborghinis. And you might find a decrease in the price, a significant decrease in the price, like they cut it by, 95%, something like that. Then you might find a decrease in the quantity demanded. And therefore, you would find, because a decrease in the price as a percentage leads to a decrease in the quantity demanded as a percentage, you represent that as a ratio to find your price elasticity of demand. You find when there's a negative divided by a negative, that gives you, the negatives cancel, and you get a positive number. That is, a positive price elasticity of demand coefficient, indicating that you're violating the law of demand. Why might that be the case? Well, in this scenario, it's entirely possible that things like Lamborghinis are what economists call Veblen goods. That is, they are goods that people buy not simply to drive around in, because it's useful to drive around in this lump of metal shaped as it is, but rather people buy Lamborghinis for the expressed purpose of showing off to other members of society how rich they are. That's its primary function. So, if the price of Lamborghinis were to fall substantially, it would lose its function as a distinguisher of success or something like that. And therefore, the people who would normally buy Lamborghinis would no longer purchase Lamborghinis. And you might say, well, yes, but everyone else who couldn't afford Lamborghinis before, now they'll buy Lamborghinis. Well, maybe not, because if the only reason anyone would want to buy a Lamborghini is to show off how rich and materially successful they are in life, it will no longer serve that purpose. No one would be interested in the Lamborghini. Also, it's a pretty useless car in terms of functionality. Most people who buy Lamborghinis live in cities. You can't drive at 350 kilometres an hour in a city. It's not possible to do that. On top of the fact that there's speed bumps everywhere now, so even if you're travelling at 20 kilometres an hour, you're going to rip out the bottom of the Lamborghini just by driving around at virtually no speed. It's a useless car, except for showing off what? How rich you are. So it's entirely possible that it could be the case that Lamborghinis have a demand curve which is not downward sloping, but upward sloping. So that's that. Have a good day.
Fundamentals of our economy are strong, but these are very, very difficult times. And we've always believed that our best days are ahead of us.
Hello?
What's up, B?
Nothing. Lost my home. Looking for a job. What's up with you?
Still in Iraq. Watching my ass.
True.
Yo, who's that?
Hold on for a second. Yo, pick up the phone.
Yo, forget the phone. I need painkillers. You got money for painkillers?
Just pick up the phone.
Hello?
What's up?
What's up?
Where's Dookie?
Hey, yo, Dookie!
Pick up the phone! Duque! Pick up the phone!
What's up?
Hello?
So what's up, B?
Change. That's what's up. Change.